and we're about our family getting healing now.
In one of the safest cities in California, a quiet college town where neighbors left doors unlocked and crime felt like something that happened somewhere else, an unthinkable horror unfolded behind closed doors. Two people were attacked in their sleep, not during a robbery, not in a moment of rage, but in a deliberate, calculated act of extreme violence. By the time police arrived, the scene inside the bedroom defied logic. So brutal, so excessive, that even seasoned investigators struggled to understand what they were seeing. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, no DNA, no weapon left behind, no witnesses. It looked disturbingly close to the perfect crime. Fear spread quickly through the community. If this could happen to them, respected, loved, and living ordinary lives, then it could happen to anyone. For months, investigators chased dead ends, suspecting family members, neighbors, even each other. The case grew colder by the day, until one phone call changed everything. The voice on the line didn't sound like a hardened criminal. It didn't sound like an adult at all. And when police realized who the caller was accusing, it forced them to confront a question that no one was prepared to ask. What if the killer wasn't a monster hiding in the shadows, but a child hiding in plain sight? Davis, California was the kind of place people moved to in order to feel safe. A clean, quiet college town surrounded by farmland, bike paths, and tree-lined streets. Crime was rare, violent crime almost unheard of. Residents believed that if anything bad ever happened here, it would be an accident, not evil. Claudia Maupin believed that too. She loved college towns, loved the energy of young people and new ideas. When she moved to Davis in the mid-1990s, she felt she had finally found where she belonged. She became deeply involved in the local Unitarian church, a place that reflected her open-minded spirituality and her belief in community. It was there that she met Oliver "Chip" Northup. Chip was widely respected in Davis. A World War II veteran, a longtime attorney, a man known for his intellect and social activism. He helped found the Unitarian church Claudia attended. Both had been married before, both had families, and both, according to those who knew them, found something rare in each other. Friends described them as inseparable, joyful, deeply in love, even after years together. Their families blended easily. Their neighbors trusted them. Nothing about their lives suggested danger. They lived quietly, comfortably, in a small condo where the nights were calm and predictable. On Saturday, April 13th, 2013, Claudia and Chip went to bed like they always did. There were no arguments, no warnings, no reason to believe that this night would be any different from the thousands that came before it. But it would be the last night of their lives. The next morning, people began to notice something was wrong. Claudia and Chip didn't show up for church. Calls to their phones went unanswered. Chip also missed a musical commitment later that day, something friends said he would never do without notice. Concern grew slowly at first. Family members tried calling again. When there was still no response, Chip's son and grandson went to the condo. They rang the doorbell. No answer. Everything looked normal from the outside. The car was there. The lights were off. It appeared as if the couple might simply be away. They left. Yet despite the savagery, the crime scene offered almost nothing to investigators. No fingerprints, no DNA, no shoe prints, no weapon. The home had not been ransacked. Valuables were untouched. Investigators couldn't even be sure it was the point of entry. The case sent shockwaves through Davis. If a respected elderly couple could be slaughtered in their own bed in a city known for safety, then no one was truly safe. Fear settled into the community. People double-checked locks. Parents worried. Neighbors watched each other with quiet suspicion. Police quickly realized they were facing either a deeply personal crime or a calculated predator. Their first instinct was to look inward. Who had access? Who had a key? Who knew the couple's routines? Family members were questioned. Friends, church acquaintances. Nothing stuck. There was no history of conflict, no obvious enemies, no financial disputes, nothing that explained the ferocity of the attack. With no physical evidence, the investigation stalled. Months passed. The case grew colder. The pressure mounted. The FBI was brought in. Dozens of agents, behavioral profilers, task force officers from outside the area. The neighborhood was flooded with law enforcement. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Still nothing. Investigators began to worry that this might be a perfect crime. Then, 2 months after the murders, a call came in. The caller asked to remain anonymous. His voice was nervous, young. He said he knew who killed Claudia and Chip. At first, officers didn't take it seriously. Tips came in constantly, most from frightened residents or people with theories fueled by fear and media coverage. But this call was different. The caller knew details that had never been released to the public. He described the crime scene with unsettling accuracy, the placement of the bodies, the objects used, the way the victims had been attacked, information only the killer, or someone close to the killer, could know. Then he named a suspect, Daniel Marsh. The name caught investigators off guard. Daniel Marsh was only 15 years old. He lived next door to Claudia and Chip at the time of the murders. He was known in the neighborhood, quiet, intelligent, a high school student. Years earlier, he had even been recognized as a hero for performing CPR and saving his father's life. Nothing about him fit the image of the monster police had been hunting. At first, officers wondered if the caller himself was involved. He was interviewed repeatedly. His story stayed consistent. He insisted Daniel had talked about killing before, talked about gore, talked about wanting to see what it felt like. Most chilling of all, he said Daniel had threatened to kill again. That was enough. Police brought Daniel Marsh in for questioning. At the start, he seemed calm, cooperative, almost eager to talk. For hours, investigators spoke with him about his life, his parents' divorce, his struggles, his anger, his isolation. He denied any involvement in the murders. He said he would never hurt anyone. But slowly, the cracks began to show. Daniel talked about violent fantasies, about thoughts he couldn't control, about imagining killing strangers, about feeling nothing toward other people. He admitted to self-harm, to starving himself, to consuming graphic, violent content online. Then, after more than 3 hours, something changed. Daniel stopped denying. He admitted he had been hunting that night, not targeting Claudia and Chip specifically, just looking for someone, anyone. He described climbing through the window, standing over their bed, watching them sleep, feeling excited, trembling, knowing this was the moment he had been building toward. What followed was a calm, detailed confession that stunned everyone in the room. He explained how he stabbed them, how he mutilated their bodies, how he placed objects inside them to confuse police, how he taped the soles of his shoes and wore gloves and a mask to avoid leaving evidence. He even told investigators he kept the knife as a souvenir. For Daniel Marsh, this wasn't a loss of control. It was fulfillment. And as police would soon learn, this was only the beginning of the nightmare. Once Daniel Marsh began talking, the room changed. The confidence he had carried into the interview dissolved, replaced not by remorse, but by something closer to relief. It was as if he had been holding the story inside for too long and finally found an audience willing to listen. Investigators quickly realized this was not a frightened teenager cornered by evidence. This was someone who wanted to be understood. He spoke about the murders with a disturbing level of detachment. He described standing over the bed, watching Claudia and Chip breathe, feeling nervous and exhilarated at the same time. He said his body was shaking, not from fear, but from anticipation. In that moment, he felt powerful, in control, alive. He explained that the stabbing was not rushed. It was deliberate. He remembered where he cut them, how many times, how their bodies reacted. He talked about curiosity, wanting to see what was inside, wanting to experiment. The placement of the phone in the glass, he said, was meant to confuse police, to make the crime seem strange and unsolvable. Daniel also explained how he planned to get away with it. He taped the bottoms of his shoes to avoid leaving footprints. He wore gloves and a mask to prevent fingerprints and DNA. He chose a house close to home so he could walk back unnoticed. And he returned to his normal routine the very next day. What shocked investigators even more was what came after. Daniel told them the murders made him feel incredible. He described a rush of adrenaline, happiness, clarity. In the weeks following the killings, his grades improved. Teachers praised him. He was named Student of the Month. To everyone around him, he appeared healthier, calmer, more focused. Inside, he said, he felt complete. Investigators asked if he felt guilty. Daniel didn't hesitate. He said no. He explained that he didn't feel empathy for other people. He didn't connect to their pain. When asked how he might kill the investigators sitting across from him, Daniel calmly listed several methods, detailing each one without emotion. He made it clear that these thoughts never stopped. To experienced agents in the room, one conclusion became unavoidable. This was not a one-time act. This was the beginning of something far worse. Police moved quickly. A search of his mother's home uncovered what Daniel had promised: bloody clothing, the knife, evidence hidden carefully but not destroyed. He had kept the weapon as a reminder of what he had done. Daniel was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. Because of the brutality of the crime, prosecutors made the decision to try him as an adult despite his age. The move was controversial, but investigators believed the facts left no other option. This was not a crime driven by immaturity or confusion. It was calculated, planned, and executed with chilling intent. Daniel entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. The defense argued that his mental health struggles, combined with antidepressant medication he had been prescribed as a child, had caused a temporary break from reality. They claimed the drugs altered his thinking, distorted his judgment, and pushed him into violence. But the prosecution had a problem for that argument. Daniel had admitted to violent fantasies long before he ever took medication. He had talked about killing years earlier. He had harmed animals. He had consumed extreme, violent material online. Counselors and therapists had documented his thoughts well before any prescriptions were involved. Even the psychiatrist initially hired by the defense concluded that Daniel was mentally ill, but not insane. He understood right from wrong. He knew exactly what he was doing. At trial, the courtroom was packed. Families of the victims sat only feet away from the boy who had destroyed their lives. They listened as investigators played recordings of his confession. They heard the details again: the stabbing, the mutilation, the lack of remorse. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They found Daniel Marsh guilty on all counts. They rejected the insanity defense. He was sentenced to 52 years to life in prison. For the families, it was a moment of relief, but not closure. No sentence could bring Claudia and Chip back. Still, knowing Daniel would never walk free offered some measure of safety, or so they thought. 2 years later, everything changed. California voters passed a new law that reshaped the justice system for juvenile offenders. Under this law, decisions to try juveniles as adults would no longer rest with prosecutors. Instead, judges would reevaluate whether young offenders should be sentenced as minors, even retroactively. Daniel Marsh suddenly had a second chance. If reclassified as a juvenile offender, he could be eligible for release as early as age 25. That meant the man who had murdered 2 people in their sleep could walk free while still in his 20s. When the families learned this, the shock was overwhelming. They had already endured the trial, the evidence, the trauma. Now they were being told they might have to relive it all again. As the legal battle resumed, Daniel did something that horrified the families even more. Through a prison rehabilitation program, he delivered a public talk, presenting himself as a reformed young man. Calm, articulate, reflective. He spoke about growth, healing, and personal transformation. He suggested that he was once broken, but now understood himself. Then he made a new claim. Daniel said he had been sexually abused as a child. The accusations stunned everyone. He had never mentioned it before. Not to police, not to therapists, not even to his closest friend. There were no records, no disclosures, no corroboration. Some believed him. Others saw it as manipulation. To the families, it felt like another violation. They fought to have the video removed. They feared the narrative was shifting, from murderer to victim. Within days, the video was taken down, but the damage was done. The hearing loomed. In court, Daniel took the stand. He spoke softly, apologetically. He said he was no longer angry, no longer hateful, no longer dangerous. He claimed he had matured, gained insight, developed empathy. But experts were not convinced. A forensic psychologist reviewed Daniel's records and administered a psychopathy assessment. His score was alarmingly high, among the highest the expert had ever seen. Traits included superficial charm, manipulation, lack of remorse, and pathological lying. The psychologist testified that Daniel posed a high risk of killing again if released. That opinion carried weight. When the judge finally delivered his decision, the courtroom held its breath. He acknowledged Daniel's intelligence, his behavior in prison, his ability to articulate remorse. But in the end, the judge said the risk was simply too great. Daniel Marsh would remain in adult prison. For now. The families exhaled. But even as they left the courtroom, they knew the fight was not truly over. Laws could change again. Appeals could come. Time could soften memories. And Daniel Marsh was still alive, still thinking, still waiting. Here is part 3 of 4, continuing seamlessly in the same cinematic investigative tone, no headings, no recap markers, and no breaks. This section is paced to keep tension rising and deepen the psychological and legal stakes. Even after the judge ruled that Daniel Marsh would remain in adult prison, the sense of finality everyone hoped for never truly arrived. For the families, the decision felt less like closure and more like a temporary barrier holding back something dangerous. The law had already shifted once. It could shift again. Daniel, meanwhile, adapted quickly to prison life. Guards noted that he was compliant, articulate, and unusually calm. He enrolled in self-help programs, volunteered for rehabilitation workshops, and spoke fluently about accountability and growth. On paper, he looked like a model inmate, but those who had studied him closely saw something else. Psychologists warned that behavior alone was not proof of change, especially in someone with strong psychopathic traits. For individuals like Daniel, learning the language of remorse did not mean feeling it. It meant understanding what others wanted to hear. Prison, they said, had given him structure, attention, and an audience, things he craved. Behind the scenes, Daniel continued to appeal. His legal team argued that the justice system had failed to account for his age, his mental illness, and his capacity for rehabilitation. They pointed to his TED-style prison talk as proof of insight. They framed his case as a tragedy of untreated trauma rather than deliberate evil. For Claudia and Chip's families, each filing reopened wounds that never fully healed. They were forced to sit through hearings where Daniel's life was discussed in hopeful terms, his future, his potential, his growth, while the lives he had taken were frozen in time. Claudia would never age. Chip would never play music again. Their futures had ended the night Daniel decided he had to do it. Family members described living in a constant state of vigilance. Every legal update triggered anxiety. Every news article brought fear. They worried not just about Daniel's release, but about what his story represented, a system struggling to reconcile compassion with public safety. Investigators who worked the case shared that fear. One agent admitted that Daniel remained among the most dangerous individuals he had ever encountered. Not because of rage or instability, but because of control. Daniel knew exactly what he was. He knew what he felt and what he didn't. And he understood how to mimic what society expected from someone seeking forgiveness. What haunted investigators most was Daniel's own words. He had said the murders were the most exhilarating experience of his life. That feeling, experts explained, does not fade. It becomes a benchmark, a peak that nothing else compares to. For someone wired like Daniel, everyday life can never compete with the power of taking a life. And when that craving resurfaces, restraint becomes fragile. Psychologists testified that psychopaths do not age out of violence in the way impulsive offenders sometimes do. They adapt. They wait. They plan. If Daniel were released young, with intelligence, mobility, and no supervision, the risk would not be theoretical. It would be immediate. The legal system, however, was evolving in a different direction. New juvenile justice reforms continued to emphasize rehabilitation over punishment. Advocates argue that children, even those who commit horrific crimes, should not be defined forever by acts committed before their brains fully developed. They warned against fear-based sentencing and irreversible decisions. Daniel's case became a lightning rod in that debate. Supporters saw him as proof that even the most disturbed youth could change. Critics saw him as proof that some crimes cross a line beyond which redemption cannot outweigh risk. For the families, the debate felt painfully abstract. They remembered Claudia's warmth, Chip's kindness, the life they had built together. They remembered the violence inflicted on their bodies, the sheer number of stab wounds, the mutilation that went beyond killing and into something far darker. They asked a simple question no law could easily answer. What about the victim's right to safety? What about the future lives that could be lost? As years passed, Daniel grew older, stronger, more articulate. His filings became more sophisticated, his supporters more vocal, his image more carefully curated. And always, the clock was ticking. If laws were applied retroactively, if appeals succeeded, if courts leaned toward mercy over caution, Daniel Marsh could eventually walk free, still young enough to start again. The families prepared themselves for that possibility, even as they prayed it would never come. They spoke publicly. They testified. They fought not out of hatred, but out of fear. Fear grounded in evidence. Fear grounded in Daniel's own admissions. They believed one thing with absolute certainty. If Daniel Marsh ever leaves prison, someone else will die. The question haunting everyone involved was no longer whether Daniel had changed. It was whether society was willing to gamble on that belief. The possibility of Daniel Marsh's release hangs over the case. Nothing about it feels resolved, because the law itself keeps shifting beneath everyone's feet. For the families, justice has become something fragile, something that must be defended again and again, long after the verdict was read and the courtroom emptied. What makes this case different is not just the brutality of the crime, but the clarity with which Daniel explained it. He did not describe confusion or voices or losing touch with reality. He described anticipation. He described excitement. He described standing over two sleeping people and feeling alive. Those details matter because they cut through every later claim of reform. They are not the words of someone who acted accidentally or impulsively. They are the words of someone who understood exactly what he was doing and enjoyed it. Experts who reviewed the case consistently returned to the same concern. Change, when it comes to individuals with severe psychopathic traits, is often performative. It is not rooted in empathy, but in strategy. Learning how to sound remorseful is not the same as feeling remorse. Understanding consequences is not the same as caring about them. In controlled environments like prison, this kind of individual can appear stable, cooperative, even inspiring. But that stability depends entirely on structure, surveillance, and limits. Outside those walls, those limits disappear. This is what terrifies investigators and clinicians alike. Daniel is not someone who lashes out when overwhelmed. He is someone who plans, someone who waits, someone who studies human reactions and adapts.